The mission that went silent. The briefing tent smelled of canvas, cigarette smoke, and the particular humidity that defined every morning in the South Pacific, a thickness in the air that made uniforms cling and paperwork curl at the edges. Lieutenant James Mitchell sat on a wooden folding chair among 24 other pilots, watching the intelligence officer tap a pointer against a map spotted with grease pencil annotations that marked known Japanese positions, suspected patrol routes, and the blue emptiness where their sector began. The mission was routine, in the way that all missions had become routine by the spring of 1945, which is to say it carried the same lethal potential as any other sortie, but had been assigned the bureaucratic designation that suggested low expected contact. Fighter sweep. Patrol pattern Charlie. 7. 4 aircraft, expected duration 3 hours. Return before the afternoon weather front moved in from the southeast. Mitchell had flown this pattern 11 times in the past month. He knew the waypoints, the fuel margins, the landmarks, a particular coral formation that from altitude looked like a broken tooth, the burnt skeleton of a Japanese transport half sunk in shallows near an unnamed atoll. He knew the radio frequencies, the recognition signals, the procedure if someone went down. He had seen 2 men from his squadron fail to return in the 6 months since he'd arrived at this forward airstrip, carved into an island whose native name he'd never learned. Their bunks had been emptied within 48 hours, their personal effects shipped home in canvas bags. The operational tempo did not permit extended mourning. Mitchell's aircraft was a Grumman F6F Hellcat, Bureau number 78324, which he had flown for 3 months without mechanical incident, beyond a sticky throttle and a radio that occasionally crackled with phantom transmissions. The ground crew chief, a staff sergeant from Pennsylvania, whose hands were perpetually stained with hydraulic fluid, had signed off on the pre-flight inspection at 0530, noting in his logbook that all systems were nominal, that the engine had run smoothly during warm-up, that the 6 Browning machine guns had been bore-sighted, and ammunition belts loaded with the standard mix of ball and tracer rounds. Mitchell trusted this ground crew the way a man trusts the parachute rigger who packs his chute, completely, because the alternative was a psychological burden too heavy to carry into combat. He had walked around the Hellcat in the pre-dawn darkness, his flashlight beam catching the dull blue-gray paint, the white star and bar insignia, the tally mark someone had stenciled near the cockpit, representing 6 confirmed kills that belonged to the aircraft's previous pilot, a man named Kowalski who had been rotated stateside 2 months earlier. Mitchell had added no marks of his own. His 3 confirmed victories had occurred in different aircraft, and he felt no particular attachment to the symbols. The killing was real enough without ornamentation. The 4-ship formation launched at 0615, the Hellcats lifting off the pierced steel planking runway in intervals that sent coral dust swirling in the rotor wash and prop blast. Mitchell was flying as number 3, positioned on the left wing of the flight leader, Lieutenant Commander Harrington, a man with 700 hours in type, and a distinguished flying cross earned during the Marianas campaign. The weather was clear at sea level, but building vertically towering cumulus formations that rose like white mountains against the horizon, their bases dark with rain that would complicate navigation and make formation flying a test of instrument discipline. The 4 Hellcats climbed through 8,000 feet, leveling at 12,000 where the air was cooler and the visibility extended 40 miles in the direction of enemy-held territory. The radios crackled with position reports, with the calm professional exchanges that marked experienced aircrew executing a familiar profile. Mitchell checked his fuel flow, his engine temperatures, the oxygen flow that kept his thinking clear at altitude. Everything nominal, everything routine, the kind of mission that would be noted in the squadron log with a single line. Patrol C7 completed without incident. The first indication of trouble arrived 90 minutes into the flight, when Mitchell's engine began running rough, a vibration that transmitted through the airframe and into his hands on the stick, a subtle change in the rhythm of the radial engine's 18 cylinders firing in sequence. He scanned his instruments, noting a slight drop in oil pressure, a temperature climb that remained within tolerances but suggested developing stress in the lubrication system. He keyed his radio and reported the condition to Harrington, keeping his voice level, stating facts without interpretation. Harrington acknowledged and asked if the condition was worsening. Mitchell watched the gauges for 30 seconds, noting that the oil pressure had stabilized at a lower value but was no longer dropping. He reported, "Stable for now," and Harrington made the tactical decision to continue the patrol rather than abort, calculating that they were closer to completing the route than returning immediately, and that Mitchell's aircraft appeared flyable as long as conditions did not deteriorate. It was a reasonable decision based on the information available. It was the kind of calculated risk that defined every operational choice in a theater where aircraft availability, mission requirements, and mechanical reliability existed in constant tension. 20 minutes later, the engine seized. There was no dramatic explosion, no fire trailing from the cowling, no cinematic catastrophe that would have provided clear narrative to the event. Instead, there was a metallic shriek as internal components lost lubrication and friction converted motion into heat and then into mechanical failure. The propeller stopped turning, the blades wind-milling for a moment before freezing in place, and the Hellcat transformed instantly from a powered aircraft into a glider with profoundly inadequate aerodynamics for sustained unpowered flight. Mitchell's training took over before conscious thought. He nosed down to maintain airspeed, keyed the radio to report engine failure, began the ditching checklist that had been drilled into him during flight school and reviewed in every water survival brief. He heard Harrington's voice acknowledging, heard instructions to maintain heading while the flight circled to mark his position, heard the reassurance that they would vector rescue assets to his coordinates. He trimmed the aircraft for best glide speed, jettisoned the canopy so it wouldn't trap him in the cockpit after impact, tightened his seat harness, and Mae West life vest, positioned his survival kit where he could grab it on egress. His altitude was 10,000 feet. His glide ratio would give him perhaps 12 miles of forward travel. Below him stretched the Pacific Ocean, its surface marked by whitecaps that indicated 15-knot winds and swells that would complicate ditching. There were no islands within his glide range. There were no ships visible in any direction. There was only water, immense and indifferent. The descent took 8 minutes. Mitchell used the time to execute the emergency procedures with mechanical precision, his hands moving through the cockpit, shutting down electrical systems, securing loose items, positioning himself for impact. He was aware of fear, but not controlled by it. The training had created neural pathways that allowed him to function through the adrenaline, to maintain cognitive clarity while his body prepared for violent trauma. He could see his shadow on the water below, growing larger as altitude decreased, and he judged the wind direction from the wave patterns, setting up his approach to ditch parallel to the swell direction to minimize the stress forces on the airframe during impact. At 500 feet, he could see individual waves, could judge their height at 6 to 8 feet, could recognize that the ditching would be hard regardless of his technique. At 200 feet, he pulled the emergency release for his seat harness, preparing to exit the instant the aircraft stopped moving, knowing that the Hellcat would sink quickly once water breached the cockpit. At 50 feet, he pulled back on the stick to flare, bleeding off airspeed, trying to grease the landing the way he would on a runway. But the ocean was not a runway, and the aircraft hit hard, nose high, tail low, the impact force compressing his spine and snapping his head forward despite the harness, water exploding around the fuselage in white spray that turned the world momentarily opaque. The Hellcat's tail hit first, the impact shearing away the horizontal stabilizer and rupturing the aft fuselage, the nose following a heartbeat later with force that collapsed the landing gear and crumpled the forward cowling. Water poured into the cockpit instantly, shockingly cold despite the tropical latitude, and Mitchell forced himself to move through the disorientation, releasing his harness, grabbing the survival kit attached to his parachute. Kicking away from the seat as the aircraft began settling into the water, he surfaced gasping, his Mae West keeping him afloat but providing no protection from the waves that broke over his head, filling his mouth with salt water, forcing him to cough and spit while treading water with legs that felt distant and unreliable. The Hellcat was 20 feet away, its tail already submerged, air escaping from the fuselage in bubbles that boiled the surface, the whole airframe tilting forward as water filled the internal spaces. Mitchell swam away from it, pushing through the swells with strokes that felt weak and uncoordinated, creating distance in case the sinking aircraft generated suction that could pull him under. He watched as the Hellcat's nose lifted briefly, the propeller blades pointing skyward like a monument, and then the entire aircraft slipped beneath the surface, leaving only disturbed water and floating debris, seat cushions, maps, the canopy that drifted 10 yards away like a discarded shell. Above him, the three remaining Hellcats circled, their engines audible as a distant drone that rose and fell as they completed their orbit. Mitchell saw them clearly, small, dark shapes against the high clouds, and he knew they were marking his position, radiating his coordinates, executing the procedures that would initiate search and rescue operations. He waved his arms above his head despite knowing they could barely see him from altitude, despite knowing that his dark flight suit against dark water made him nearly invisible. But the gesture was instinctive, a human need to signal his continued existence. He reached for the survival kit still attached to his torso, fingers numb and clumsy as he worked the quick-release buckle, pulling the yellow rubberized package close. Inside was a one-man life raft, folded into a compact bundle, CO2 cartridges for inflation, a bail bucket, a sea anchor, and the small canvas bag containing emergency supplies, water purification tablets, a signal mirror, dye marker, fishing line, a first aid kit, and the M8 pyrotechnic pistol with 4 flare cartridges. Mitchell opened the raft package, pulled the inflation lanyard, and felt the CO2 cartridges discharge with a hiss that sounded too loud in the vast ocean silence. The raft unfolded and inflated in seconds, its bright yellow fabric designed for visibility, and Mitchell used the last of his coordinated strength to heave himself over the tubular side, rolling into the interior where he lay gasping, water streaming from his flight suit, his body shaking with the first waves of shock and exhaustion. He lay there for several minutes, feeling the raft rise and fall with the swells, feeling the sun on his face now that he was out of the water, feeling the cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the body's response to trauma. Above him, the 3 Hellcats continued their circle. He could hear Harrington's voice crackling through the air on guard frequency, broadcasting his position to any listening aircraft or vessel, repeating the latitude and longitude that had been calculated from their last known waypoint and Mitchell's glide path. The procedure was clear. The Rescue Coordination Center would be notified. Assets would be vectored to his position if available. The flight would remain on station as long as fuel permitted, then return to base, leaving Mitchell alone with the coordinates that existed on a map, but meant nothing to the empty ocean that surrounded him in every direction. 30 minutes after ditching, the 3 Hellcats broke formation and turned toward home, their fuel states requiring departure before they themselves became emergencies. Mitchell watched them go, watched the dark shapes grow smaller against the clouds, watched until he could no longer hear their engines. And then he was alone in a silence broken only by the slap of water against the raft and the occasional cry of a seabird that circled overhead, perhaps curious, perhaps simply continuing its own routine. Mitchell checked the survival kit methodically, inventorying the contents with the same precision he'd used for pre-flight inspections. 4 flare cartridges, 1 signal mirror, 1 dye marker canister. A fishing kit he had no intention of using given the sharks that patrolled these waters. Water purification tablets that required fresh water to purify. A first aid kit containing bandages, sulfa powder, and morphine syrettes he hoped he wouldn't need. The M8 flare pistol itself, a stubby aluminum device that felt absurdly light given the weight of hope it now carried. He looked at the flares for a long time, knowing that each one represented a single chance to be seen, a single moment of visibility that would arc across the sky and burn for perhaps 10 seconds before falling dark into the water. 4 chances, 4 decisions he would have to make about when the probability of rescue justified expending an irreplaceable resource. He had been trained on the calculus: wait for confirmed aircraft or ship sighting, fire only when the target was within visual range, conserve until the likelihood of success was high, but the training had not prepared him for the psychological weight of holding finite hope in his hands, while floating alone in an ocean that extended beyond every horizon. He secured the flare pistol in the survival kit and tried not to think about the fact that the current was moving him, that every minute carried him farther from the coordinates Harrington had reported, that the search area was expanding with each passing hour into a circle whose size would soon exceed the capacity of any rescue operation to effectively patrol. The sun climbed toward noon, the tropical heat building until the raft's interior became an oven that baked Mitchell's wet flight suit into a steaming second skin that chafed his neck and wrists. He tried to rig the raft's small fabric canopy for shade, but the wind kept collapsing it, and eventually he gave up, accepting the sun as another variable beyond his control. He drank from the emergency water container, small sips that barely moistened his mouth, knowing that dehydration would become critical before hunger, that his body would begin failing in predictable stages if rescue did not arrive within 72 hours. He thought about his squadron, about the empty seat at the evening briefing, about Harrington filing the mission report that would note one aircraft lost to mechanical failure, one pilot down in coordinates that would be recorded with the precision of navigation, but would mean nothing if the ocean's currents had moved him beyond the search radius. He thought about the administrative process that would begin, the telegram that would be sent to his parents in Oregon, the careful language that would describe him as missing rather than dead, because the military did not declare death without evidence, and the ocean rarely provided evidence. He tried not to think about the men who had gone down before him, the two from his squadron and the dozens from other units he'd heard about in the mess tent conversations. Pilots who ditched successfully but were never found, who drifted until dehydration or exposure claimed them, whose rafts were sometimes recovered weeks later empty or containing remains that had moved beyond identification. The Pacific Theater's missing in action list grew longer each month, and Mitchell understood now with visceral clarity that his name might join it, that survival depended on a chain of events beyond his control. Accurate position reporting, available rescue assets, favorable weather, operational priorities that placed individual rescue above other mission requirements, and the simple luck of being visible at the moment when someone was looking in his direction. The afternoon brought clouds that built into the promised weather front, their shadows racing across the water's surface, their bulk blocking the sun and providing temporary relief from the heat. Mitchell watched them build, knowing that rain would soon follow, that the visibility would drop to hundreds of feet, that any search aircraft would be grounded or rerouted, that his window for rescue was closing with each mile the front advanced. He checked the survival kit again, not because he'd forgotten its contents, but because the action provided something to do, some small exercise of agency in a situation where he controlled almost nothing. The flare pistol sat in its waterproof pouch, waiting for the decision he would have to make, the calculation that would determine whether he fired at the sound of a distant engine or waited for visual confirmation, whether he conserved his resources or spent them on possibility. As the sun descended toward the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, Mitchell realized he had not heard an aircraft in 6 hours. The search, if there had been one, had either concluded or moved to a different sector. He was alone on an ocean that stretched 3,000 miles in one direction and 5,000 in another, alone with 4 flares and the diminishing probability that anyone was still looking for him. He watched the sunset with the attention of someone who understood that this might be one of his last, and when darkness finally settled over the water like a blanket, complete and absolute, he lay back in the raft and stared at stars that appeared one by one, their light traveling across distances that made his isolation seem almost trivial by comparison. Somewhere to the west, his squadron was finishing dinner. Somewhere in Oregon, his parents were living their ordinary lives, unaware that their son was clinging to a yellow raft in the middle of an ocean, counting flares and waiting for a sound that might never come. Somewhere on this same ocean, other men were fighting their own battles. Pilots attacking Japanese positions, sailors manning their watches, submarines running silent beneath the surface. All of them part of a vast machinery of war that would continue regardless of whether James Mitchell survived the night. He closed his eyes against the stars and tried to sleep, knowing that the real test of survival had only just begun, that the ditching had been the easy part, and that the hours ahead would determine whether his training, his resources, and his will would be sufficient to keep him alive long enough for rescue to arrive, if rescue was coming at all. The raft rocked gently on the swells, and the night settled in with the weight of all the Pacific's empty water, and James Mitchell began the long wait that would either end in salvation or simply end. The calculus of survival. The first full night passed in fragments of consciousness that never quite achieved sleep, Mitchell drifting into something that resembled rest before a wave slapped the raft's side or his body's involuntary. Shivering jolted him back to awareness. The darkness was absolute in a way he had never experienced on land, where even the remotest locations offered some ambient light, some reference point for orientation. Here there was nothing except the stars overhead when clouds permitted their visibility, and the phosphorescence that occasionally sparked in the water when something moved beneath the surface, fish or larger predators. He couldn't know, and tried not to imagine. The Mae West life vest remained inflated under his flight suit, the rubberized fabric pressing against his chest and restricting his breathing in a way that became more noticeable as the hours accumulated. He couldn't remove it. The one-man raft was reliable in calm seas, but offered no guarantee against capsizing if the weather deteriorated, and the vest represented his final insurance against drowning if he found himself back in the water. So he endured the constriction, the chafing where the vest's edges rubbed against his neck, the constant awareness of its presence as a reminder of how tenuous his security remained. Dawn arrived with agonizing slowness, the eastern horizon transitioning from black to gray to a pale blue that hurt his eyes after hours of darkness. Mitchell had been awake for the last hour of night, watching for the change, needing the psychological reassurance that day would return, that the world still operated according to predictable patterns, even if his own circumstances had become radically unpredictable. The sunrise revealed an ocean that looked identical in every direction, rolling swells that marched toward him in lines that suggested the wind had shifted during the night, whitecaps that indicated sustained breeze, and an emptiness so complete it seemed impossible that millions of men were fighting a war across this same body of water. He was 30 hours into his survival situation, 30 hours since the Hellcat's engine had seized and sent him into the glide that ended with impact and the cold shock of immersion. 30 hours since he'd had anything resembling food, though hunger had not yet become a primary concern. The human body could endure weeks without food if necessary. Water was the critical variable, and Mitchell's emergency supply consisted of 2 small metal containers, each holding perhaps a pint of fresh water, along with a collapsible canvas bag designed to collect rainwater if precipitation occurred. He allowed himself 3 small sips from the first container, enough to wet his mouth and throat without significantly depleting the supply. The water was metallic tasting from its container, but represented pure relief, and he forced himself to replace the cap before the temptation to drink more could override his discipline. The survival training had been clear about rationing. Small amounts at regular intervals maintained cognitive function better than larger quantities consumed irregularly, and preserving mental clarity was essential for making the decisions that would determine whether he lived or died. He had already made one critical decision during the night. He would not fire a flare without visual confirmation of a potential rescue asset. Sound alone was insufficient. The acoustic properties of the ocean could carry engine noise across vast distances, creating illusions of proximity when an aircraft might be 20 miles away and traveling in a direction that would never bring it within visual range of a small raft. Wasting a flare on phantom hope would reduce his already limited resources by 25%. The mathematics of survival demanded better odds. Mitchell conducted a systematic inventory of his physical condition, using the diagnostic method the flight surgeons had taught during water survival training. He flexed his fingers and toes, checking for numbness or loss of circulation that might indicate the early stages of immersion injury, despite being out of the water. He probed the bruises that had formed across his chest and shoulders, where the harness had restrained him during ditching, finding pain but no indication of broken ribs or internal bleeding. He examined his hands, noting the salt-crusted skin, the wrinkles that indicated prolonged moisture exposure, the small cuts where he'd scraped against metal during his exit from the sinking Hellcat. None of the injuries were serious in themselves, but each represented a vulnerability, an entry point for infection, a source of pain that would compound over time. A drain on his body's resources as it worked to heal damage while simultaneously fighting dehydration and exposure. He conducted this assessment with clinical detachment, viewing his body as a machine whose operating parameters needed monitoring, because emotional attachment to his own suffering would not improve his situation and might compromise the clear thinking he needed to maintain. The survival kit contained a first aid pouch with supplies that seemed both comprehensive and utterly inadequate. Bandages that would be useful for significant lacerations, but offered nothing for the systemic challenges of exposure and dehydration. Sulfa powder to prevent infection in wounds he didn't currently have. Morphine syrettes for pain management, but using them would dull the mental acuity he needed to stay alert for rescue opportunities. He left the first aid kit closed and turned his attention to the other contents of the survival pack. The signal mirror was a rectangular piece of polished metal with a sighting hole at its center, designed to reflect sunlight toward distant aircraft or ships with enough intensity to be visible across miles of ocean. The technique required practice, holding the mirror at the correct angle while aligning the reflected beam with the target through the sighting hole. And Mitchell had rehearsed it during training, but never under actual survival conditions. He practiced now, catching the morning sunlight and casting the reflected beam across the water's surface, watching the bright spot dance across the swells, adjusting his grip to steady the reflection. The mirror worked exactly as designed, but its effectiveness depended entirely on having a target to aim at, and the horizon remained empty in every direction. The dye marker was a canister containing fluorescent powder that would spread across the water's surface when released, creating a bright patch visible from aircraft at altitude. Its use was limited to situations where aircraft were confirmed overhead but having difficulty spotting the raft visually, a circumstance that required Mitchell to already be in communication or to have reason to believe searchers were actively looking in his specific area. Using it preemptively would waste the marker and accomplish nothing except staining the water temporarily before currents dispersed the dye into invisibility. Like the flares, the dye marker represented a finite resource that demanded careful judgment about deployment timing. Mitchell secured it in the survival kit alongside the mirror and turned his attention to the fishing equipment, a small canvas roll containing hooks, line, and a folding knife. The instructions suggested that survival fishing could supplement water rations and provide needed protein, but Mitchell knew from briefings that fishing in open Pacific waters carried the nearly certain risk of attracting sharks. The predators patrolled these waters in populations that had been undisturbed by the war, and blood in the water from caught fish would draw them from distances measured in miles. He had no interest in sharing his raft with a shark investigation, no desire to create situations where his small inflatable vessel might be compromised by a curious predator. The fishing kit went back into storage, acknowledged but unused. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed high enough to transform the raft into a solar oven, despite the ventilation provided by the open design. Mitchell's flight suit, which had seemed essential during the cold night, now became a liability, the dark fabric absorbing heat, the multiple layers trapping moisture against his skin. He couldn't remove it entirely. The suit provided protection against sun exposure that would otherwise burn his skin into blistering damage within hours under the tropical sun. Instead, he unzipped the front and rolled up the sleeves, creating minimal ventilation while maintaining coverage for the most vulnerable areas. He tried again to rig the raft's small canopy, finally achieving a configuration that provided a few square feet of shade by securing one edge to the raft's inflation valve and the other to the survival kit used as an improvised anchor point. The shade was inadequate, but better than nothing, and he positioned himself to keep his head and shoulders beneath it while his legs remained exposed. The compromise was imperfect, but represented the kind of tactical adaptation that survival required, accepting partial solutions because perfect ones were unavailable. The heat brought thirst with an intensity that surprised him despite knowing it would come. His mouth felt coated with something that wasn't quite cotton, but had that same dry, foreign texture. His tongue seemed too large for his mouth, and swallowing required conscious effort. He allowed himself another 3 sips from the water container, this time holding each sip in his mouth for several seconds, before swallowing, trying to maximize the sensation of hydration even if the actual quantity was minimal. He calculated that at his current consumption rate, the 2 water containers would last perhaps 3 days if he maintained iron discipline, less if heat stress increased his body's fluid requirements, longer if rain arrived to replenish his supply. 3 days, 72 hours. The number felt both impossibly long and frighteningly short, depending on whether he focused on the suffering required to endure that span or the rescue operation that needed to find him before the deadline arrived. Mitchell forced himself to think about the search procedures, reconstructing from memory the protocols covered during squadron briefings. Search and rescue operations in the Pacific Theater operated under constraints that made every mission a calculation of probability against resources. PBY Catalina flying boats had the range to patrol vast areas, but were slow and vulnerable to interception if they ventured too close to enemy-held territory. OS-2U Kingfisher floatplanes could be catapulted from cruisers and battleships, but had limited range and could only operate in relatively calm seas. Submarines sometimes surfaced to recover downed airmen, but did so at considerable risk, exposing themselves to air attack during the time required for rescue operations. Destroyers and destroyer escorts might be vectored to search coordinates, but only if their primary mission permitted the diversion. And in a theater where Japanese air and naval forces remained active, most vessels operated under strict routing that prioritized tactical objectives over individual rescue. The system functioned, but it functioned imperfectly. And Mitchell knew from squadron scuttlebutt that the recovery rate for pilots downed in open ocean was significantly lower than for those who managed to ditch near friendly held islands or within range of dedicated rescue. Submarines positioned along bomber routes. His own ditching had occurred during a routine patrol, not a major strike operation that would justify pre-positioned rescue assets. His coordinates had been transmitted by Harrington's flight, but the position was approximate, calculated from their last waypoint and Mitchell's estimated glide path, accurate perhaps to within 5 miles under ideal conditions. Possibly less accurate if Harrington had misjudged the glide distance or if navigation errors had accumulated during the patrol. And even if the coordinates were perfect, Mitchell was no longer at those coordinates. The current had been moving him since the moment he entered the water, and without any reference point to measure against, he had no way to determine his direction of drift or his speed. He might be moving 1 knot or 3 knots in any direction determined by the complex interaction of surface currents, wind patterns, and tidal forces. Over 30 hours, even a 1-knot drift would have displaced him 30 nautical miles from his ditching position. The search area required to account for that uncertainty was enormous. A circle with a 60-mile diameter encompassing more than 2,800 square miles of ocean, an area larger than some states, across which a single yellow raft and a single man represented a target so small as to be nearly invisible, even under perfect visibility conditions. The mathematics were discouraging, but Mitchell forced himself to work through them anyway, because understanding the reality of his situation was better than operating on false hope. APBY Catalina flying at patrol altitude with good visibility might spot a raft from 5 miles away under ideal conditions, meaning its effective search width was roughly 10 miles for each pass. To cover a 2,800 square mile search area with 10-mile-wide search lanes would require multiple aircraft flying multiple sorties over multiple days. And that level of commitment demanded resources that might not be available for a single missing pilot when the squadron had operational tasking that required aircraft and crews for combat missions. Mitchell didn't know what priority had been assigned to his rescue. He didn't know if anyone was searching at all. The absence of aircraft since his wingmen departed the previous morning suggested either that no search had been launched, that the search was occurring in a different area based on incorrect drift calculations, or that weather had grounded rescue operations. None of these possibilities provided comfort. By early afternoon, clouds began building again. The same pattern of convective development that characterized Pacific weather, with towering cumulus that grew from small white puffs at dawn into massive formations by midday. Mitchell watched them with mixed feelings. Rain would mean fresh water, potentially enough to replenish his supply and extend his survival timeline significantly. But rain also meant reduced visibility, rough seas, and the grounding of any aircraft that might be searching for him. He would trade long-term survival capability for short-term rescue opportunity, a bargain whose calculus shifted depending on how optimistic he felt about the search effort. As the clouds built and their bases darkened with the promise of precipitation, Mitchell prepared the collapsible canvas water bag, unfolding it and positioning it to catch runoff from the raft's canopy. The rain arrived within an hour, first as scattered drops that pattered against the raft's fabric, then as a deluge that reduced visibility to a few dozen yards and filled the air with a roar that drowned out all other sound. Mitchell opened his mouth to catch rain directly, feeling the fresh water on his tongue, tasting the slight rubber flavor from the raft's canopy, but not caring because it was water, and his body craved it with an intensity that overrode aesthetic considerations. He filled the canvas bag, watching the water level rise until the bag held perhaps 2 quarts, then secured it carefully and allowed himself to drink directly from the canopy runoff, gulping mouthfuls that soothed his throat and replenished some of the deficit his body had accumulated over 36 hours of inadequate hydration. The rain was cold, shocking against his sun-heated skin, and within minutes he was shivering again despite the tropical latitude. He huddled under the canopy, trying to minimize heat loss while still collecting water, accepting the misery of being cold and wet because the water was worth the discomfort. The storm lasted 40 minutes, then moved on as quickly as it had arrived, leaving Mitchell drenched, but with his water supply nearly doubled. He inventoried his new resources, the 2 original containers still mostly full, the canvas bag now holding 2 quarts, a total of perhaps 5 quarts of fresh water that, if carefully rationed, might extend his survival timeline to a week or more. The psychological impact of the rain was more significant than the physical benefit. Having fresh water meant having time, and having time meant maintaining hope that rescue might still occur. But the rain had also confirmed his fear about visibility. During the storm, he could barely see 20 yards. Any aircraft overhead would have been invisible to him, and he would have been invisible to them. The flares would have been useless, fired into clouds that would have absorbed the light without revealing his position to anyone beyond visual range. And if the weather pattern continued, if storms rolled through every afternoon, as they often did in this region, then his window for potential rescue might be limited to morning hours when visibility was good, but when no aircraft had appeared for 2 consecutive days. He tried not to calculate the diminishing probability of rescue as time extended, tried not to think about the statistical reality that most downed pilots were recovered within the first 48 hours, or not recovered at all. Tried not to acknowledge that he was approaching that threshold with no indication that anyone was looking for him. The afternoon after the rain was spent in a state of enforced patience that felt more draining than the physical challenges of heat and thirst. Mitchell had nothing to do. No tasks to occupy his hands, no problems to solve that hadn't already been addressed through his inventory and preparation work. He was a man accustomed to action, to the constant demands of flight operations, to schedules that filled every hour with briefings, missions, maintenance debriefs, and the social rituals of squadron life. Now he had only waiting, and waiting required a different kind of discipline, the ability to endure boredom and isolation without allowing his mind to spiral into despair, or his vigilance to lapse into the kind of inattention that might cause him to miss a distant aircraft or the subtle change in conditions that would require action. He watched the horizon with methodical attention, scanning through 360 degrees every few minutes, looking for the dark speck that might be an aircraft or the vertical line that might be a ship's mast. He saw nothing except ocean and sky, the boundary between them sometimes sharp and sometimes blurred by haze, but always empty of human presence. As the second sunset approached, Mitchell allowed himself to acknowledge the fear he'd been suppressing through activity and analysis. He was alone on an ocean so vast that his raft represented a target smaller than a pinpoint on the operational maps his squadron used for mission planning. He had limited resources that would keep him alive for perhaps a week if he maintained perfect discipline, and if the weather cooperated, and if his body held up under the stress of exposure. He had 4 flares, each representing a gamble about timing and probability. He had no way to communicate with anyone, no radio that survived the ditching, no means of signaling except the visual devices that required someone to be looking in his direction at the moment he used them. He was entirely dependent on factors beyond his control: the accuracy of his reported position, the resources allocated to search operations, the skill and persistence of rescue crews, the weather conditions that would either facilitate or prevent aerial search, and the simple luck of being visible when visibility mattered. The fear was not panic. It was the clear-eyed recognition that his survival was improbable, that the ocean claimed men regularly and without drama, that his training and preparation might prove insufficient against the simple mathematics of distance and time and limited resources. But fear, acknowledged and examined, lost some of its power to paralyze. Mitchell had been afraid before, during his first combat mission when Japanese fighters had engaged his flight, during carrier landings in rough seas, during the night missions that required trusting instruments through clouds that obscured all external reference. Fear was information, not destiny. It told him the stakes were high and that failure carried permanent consequences. But it didn't determine the outcome. His outcome would be determined by his decisions: how carefully he rationed water, how wisely he used his signaling devices, how well he maintained his physical and mental condition, how effectively he balanced hope against realism. These were variables he could influence even if he couldn't control the broader circumstances of his situation. The second night fell with the same absolute darkness as the first, and Mitchell settled into the raft with the canvas bag of fresh water secured against his chest, the survival kit positioned where he could reach it quickly if needed, and his hand resting on the waterproof pouch that contained the flare pistol. He had decided on his criteria for firing a flare: visual confirmation of an aircraft within estimated range of 3 miles, or the sound of engines that persisted for more than 2 minutes, suggesting a search pattern rather than a transit flight. The decision gave him a framework for action, a clear standard that would prevent either premature waste of resources or paralysis when opportunity arrived. Whether opportunity would arrive remained unknown, but he had done everything within his power to be ready when it did. The rest was timing and chance, and Mitchell closed his eyes against the stars and tried to sleep, knowing that the third day would bring either rescue or the continuation of an ordeal whose duration remained unknowable, and that his task was simply to endure with whatever discipline and hope he could sustain for as long as his resources and his body would allow. The search and Rescue Coordination Center operated from a converted storage building at the edge of the main airfield. Its interior walls, covered with maps marked by grease pencil annotations that tracked ongoing operations across a theater spanning millions of square miles. Lieutenant Commander Robert Vance had been running the SAR desk for 7 months, long enough to understand the brutal arithmetic that governed his work. Too many downed airmen, too few rescue assets, too much ocean. The morning after Mitchell's ditching, Vance had received the initial report from Lieutenant Commander Harrington's flight, one F6F Hellcat, down due to mechanical failure, pilot observed to ditch successfully. Coordinates provided, 3 aircraft remained on station for 30 minutes before fuel state required departure. The report was thorough and professional, exactly what Vance needed to initiate rescue procedures. But it arrived at a moment when those procedures were competing against operational realities that would severely constrain what could be done. Vance plotted Mitchell's coordinates on the large-scale chart that dominated one wall of the coordination center, marking the position with a red grease pencil circle that represented the initial search area, a 10-mile radius that accounted for navigation uncertainty and the pilot's glide distance. The position was 85 nautical miles from the nearest friendly airfield, well beyond the range of the OS-2U Kingfisher floatplanes that operated from cruisers in the area, but within the operational envelope of the PBY Catalina flying boats that conducted long-range patrol and rescue missions. Vance checked the availability board, noting that 2 Catalinas were theoretically available for search tasking. But both aircraft had maintenance issues noted in their status logs, one with an engine that was running rough and awaiting parts, another with a hull leak that required patching before it could safely conduct water landings. A third Catalina was operational, but had been assigned to an anti-submarine patrol along a convoy route, where intelligence indicated possible Japanese submarine activity. Reassigning that aircraft to search for a single downed pilot would leave the convoy without dedicated air coverage during a vulnerable transit. The decision Vance faced was one he'd confronted dozens of times before, and it never became easier. Individual rescue had to be weighed against collective risk, the life of one pilot against the potential loss of an entire convoy if submarine contact occurred without air assets available to prosecute the attack. The protocols provided guidance but not absolute answers. Search and rescue operations should be conducted when feasible, when they did not compromise primary mission effectiveness, when resources were available without creating unacceptable gaps in coverage. Vance made the decision that the protocols suggested. He would defer the dedicated search until one of the maintenance-impaired Catalinas could be returned to operational status, but he would broadcast Mitchell's coordinates to all aircraft operating in the region, with instructions to maintain visual lookout during routine patrols. It was a compromise that preserved operational capability while creating some possibility of opportunistic rescue. But Vance knew it was unlikely to succeed. Aircraft on patrol missions followed specific routes optimized for their primary tasking, and the probability of one of those routes passing within visual range of Mitchell's position was low and decreasing with every hour as currents displaced the downed pilot from his reported coordinates. The broadcast went out on guard frequency at 0800 hours, roughly 14 hours after Mitchell's ditching. All aircraft, be advised, one F6F pilot down at coordinates, followed by the latitude and longitude that Harrington had provided. The transmission was received by 6 aircraft currently airborne in the sector, 2 Marine Corps F4U Corsairs on combat air patrol, 3 Army Air Force's B-25 Mitchell bombers returning from a strike mission, and 1 Navy PBM Mariner conducting maritime reconnaissance. None of these aircraft were within 50 miles of Mitchell's reported position. The Corsairs had fuel for another 90 minutes before they needed to return to their carrier, insufficient for a diversion to search coordinates that lay outside their assigned patrol area. The B-25s were flying at 12,000 feet on a direct course to their base, and deviating to search would require descending to an altitude where visual spotting was possible. Burning fuel they'd calculated to minimum reserves. The PBM Mariner was closest, but operating under strict orders to maintain electronic silence and avoid deviating from its reconnaissance route due to suspected Japanese air activity in the region. The pilot copied the coordinates, noted them on his kneeboard card, but continued his assigned mission without altering course. Mitchell's position was acknowledged by 6 crews who continued flying away from him, their operational requirements taking precedence over a search that would have required them to compromise their primary missions. By late morning, the first Catalina had been returned to operational status, its engine issue resolved through the replacement of a faulty magneto. Vance briefed the crew, a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, 2 gunners, and a rescue swimmer, on Mitchell's last known position and the search parameters. The Catalina launched at 1100 hours, roughly 21 hours after Mitchell had gone down, climbing to 1500 feet, where visibility was optimal for spotting small objects on the water's surface. The navigator calculated a search pattern based on Mitchell's coordinates and estimated drift, producing a box pattern that would cover a 40-square-mile area over the course of 3 hours. The pattern assumed a drift rate of 1 knot in a westerly direction based on prevailing currents in the region, but the assumption was educated guesswork. Actual drift could be higher or lower in a different direction, influenced by local wind patterns and subsurface currents that varied across the operational area. The Catalina flew the pattern with meticulous precision, the crew scanning the water's surface through binoculars, looking for the yellow of a life raft or the fluorescent green of dye marker, seeing nothing except white caps and the occasional piece of floating debris, logs, seaweed mats, debris from sunken ships that littered the Pacific surface. The search was complicated by sea state and visibility conditions that degraded throughout the morning as the convective weather pattern built towering cumulus that cast moving shadows across the water and created patches of rain that reduced visibility to near zero. The Catalina diverted around the worst cells, maintaining the search pattern where conditions permitted, but large sections of the planned grid were obscured by weather that prevented effective visual scanning. After 3 hours, with fuel state requiring return to base, the Catalina crew had covered perhaps 60% of their intended search area without citing any indication of Mitchell's raft. The pilot radioed the results to Vance. Search area Charlie, 7 completed negative contact, weather conditions limiting visibility, recommend continued search with expanded area to account for drift. The recommendation was logged, but implementation would depend on aircraft availability and competing operational requirements, neither of which were favorable. Back at the coordination center, Vance updated Mitchell's position on the chart, expanding the search radius to 15 miles to account for 24 hours of drift at an estimated 1.5 knots. The expanded circle encompassed 700 square miles of ocean, an area that would require multiple aircraft conducting multiple sorties to search effectively. He checked the availability board again, noting that the Catalina that had just returned would require refueling and crew rest before another mission, that the second Catalina was still awaiting hull repairs, that no other long-range assets were available for immediate tasking. The anti-submarine Catalina was still committed to convoy escort. A request for support from Army Air Force's long-range patrol aircraft had been submitted but not yet answered, likely because those assets were tasked with their own operational requirements. Vance made another notation in the log. Continued search pending asset availability. Coordinates broadcast to all area aircraft. Situation under review. The missing pilot's absence had moved from immediate concern to administrative processing. His personal effects had been inventoried and packed by the squadron administration officer, a first lieutenant who performed the task with respectful efficiency, folding the uniform items, collecting the letters and photographs, cataloging the small personal items, a watch, a pocket knife, a leather wallet containing $15, and a photo of a young woman whose relationship to Mitchell was not immediately apparent. The inventory was typed on official forms, copies made for the record, and the packed belongings stored pending final disposition. Mitchell's bunk had been reassigned to a replacement pilot who had arrived 3 days earlier, fresh from stateside training, eager and nervous in equal measure. The new pilot unpacked his gear into the same locker Mitchell had used, unaware of or indifferent to its previous occupant, focused on the prospect of his first combat missions. The squadron commander, a major with 2 years in theater, had drafted the initial letter to Mitchell's parents, using the careful language that conveyed uncertainty rather than finality. Missing in action following mechanical failure during routine patrol operations, search and rescue efforts underway. Further information will be provided as it becomes available. The letter sat unsigned on the commander's desk, held pending the 48-hour window that sometimes brought news that changed missing to recovered or presumed lost. Lieutenant Commander Harrington, who had led the flight and reported Mitchell's coordinates, spent the day after the ditching flying 2 additional missions, a dawn combat air patrol and an afternoon escort for a photo reconnaissance flight, before returning to the coordination center to check on the search status. Vance showed him the chart, the expanding search circle, the notation about the Catalina's negative contact. Harrington studied the map silently, his finger tracing the distance from Mitchell's ditching point to the search area the Catalina had covered, noting the gap created by weather avoidance. He asked about continued search plans, and Vance gave him the answer that experience had made familiar. "We'll continue as assets become available, but I can't guarantee dedicated coverage. Your position report was good, but if he drifted faster than estimated or in a different direction, he could be outside the search area we've covered." It was an honest assessment, neither optimistic nor defeatist, simply acknowledging the variables that made rescue operations in the Pacific Theater part science and part fortune. Harrington returned to his squadron and briefed the other pilots on the search status during the evening informal gathering in the ready room. The news was received with quiet acknowledgement. Mitchell was one of them, and his loss was personal. But he was also the latest in a series of pilots who had gone down and not returned. The squadron had lost 8 men in 6 months, some to combat, some to operational accidents, some like Mitchell to mechanical failures that transformed routine missions into survival situations. Each loss was mourned in the compressed, stoic manner that military culture enforced, grief acknowledged but not dwelt upon, the operational tempo continuing because the war demanded it. Someone mentioned that Mitchell had been a solid pilot, careful and professional, the kind of aviator you wanted on your wing. Someone else recalled a poker game where Mitchell had bluffed successfully with a terrible hand, winning a pot that had grown large enough to be memorable. The stories lasted 10 minutes, and then the conversation moved to other topics. The next day's mission schedule, rumors about a rotation policy that might send some of them home after a certain number of combat hours, speculation about how much longer the war would continue. Mitchell's absence became part of the background reality, like the heat and the bad food and the periodic air raids that sent everyone to shelters while Japanese bombers targeted the airfield. By the morning of the 3rd day after Mitchell's ditching, the search had effectively been suspended. No aircraft were available for dedicated search tasking, and the broadcast of his coordinates had produced no sighting reports from the dozens of aircraft that had operated in the region over the past 60 hours. Vance updated the status board, changing Mitchell's case from active search to alert status, which meant that his coordinates remained in the system, and any aircraft operating in the general area would be reminded to maintain visual lookout. But no specific resources were being allocated to finding him. It was a bureaucratic transition that reflected operational reality. The search window had closed. The probability of successful rescue had declined to a level where continued dedicated effort could not be justified against competing demands. And the ocean had likely claimed another pilot, despite the best efforts of a system that was well-intentioned but fundamentally limited by the constraints of distance, weather, and insufficient resources. The second Catalina, finally repaired and returned to operational status, was immediately tasked with convoy escort rather than search duties. A Japanese submarine had been reported in the approaches to a major harbor, and all available patrol aircraft were being concentrated on anti-submarine operations that took precedence over individual rescue. The pilot who had flown the initial search mission asked Vance about continuing Mitchell's search during the escort mission's transit, and Vance approved the request with the understanding that it was secondary to the primary anti-submarine tasking. The Catalina's route would take it within 30 miles of Mitchell's original coordinates, close enough that the crew could conduct visual scanning while en route, though the probability of spotting a small raft from that distance was minimal unless Mitchell happened to be directly along their flight path. The crew maintained lookout during the transit, scanning the ocean's surface through binoculars seeing nothing that resembled a life raft among the countless whitecaps and patches of floating debris that marked the Pacific's surface. Huh. At the coordination center, Mitchell's red circle on the chart was joined by three others, new cases from the past 48 hours, each representing another downed pilot, each requiring the same calculus of available resources against probable success. Vance worked through the prioritization systematically, allocating search efforts based on factors that included how recently the pilot had gone down, how accurately his position was known, whether he had been observed to survive the ditching or bailout, and what assets were available for tasking. Mitchell's case, now 72 hours old with an initial search completed and negative results, fell to the bottom of the priority list. The newer cases had better probability of successful rescue if search assets could be deployed quickly, and the operational logic dictated focusing limited resources where they were most likely to produce results. It was the same calculation that governed medical triage, treating the patients most likely to survive rather than expending resources on cases where the prognosis was poor. Vance understood the logic and applied it professionally, but that understanding did not make it easier to mark a case as suspended, knowing that somewhere on that vast ocean, a man might still be alive, still hoping, still believing that someone was looking for him. The official determination of Mitchell's status would not occur for weeks. The protocols required exhausting all reasonable search efforts and waiting a prescribed period before transitioning from missing in action to presumed lost. During that interval, Mitchell's name would appear on daily status reports. His case would remain open in the Coordination Center's files, and any sighting of debris or any intelligence from coastwatchers or indigenous sources would be evaluated for possible connection to his ditching. But the active search, the dedicated allocation of aircraft and crews to finding him, had ended after a single Catalina mission that covered 60% of an estimated search area that was itself based on assumptions about drift rate and direction that might have been incorrect. The mathematics were brutal. One pilot down in millions of square miles of ocean, one Catalina mission covering perhaps 40 square miles effectively, a success rate that depended on the pilot being within that small searched area at the time the aircraft passed overhead, and weather conditions that had prevented even that limited coverage from being complete. In Mitchell's squadron, the letter to his parents was finally signed and sent, making its way through the military postal system that would deliver it to Oregon in 2 weeks, transforming their son's status from present to absent, from assumed safe to confirmed missing, from the daily routine of not hearing news to the terrible weight of bad news that might become worse. The squadron moved forward with its operational schedule, new missions briefed and flown, new pilots integrated into flights, new targets struck, new threats encountered, and overcome or succumbed to. Mitchell's name appeared on the squadron's casualty list, joining the others who had been lost, becoming part of the statistical record that measured the cost of combat operations in the Pacific theater. His belongings remained packed, awaiting final disposition instructions that would come when his status was officially determined. His replacement pilot flew his first combat mission and returned safely, beginning the accumulation of experience that might keep him alive through his tour, or might not. The same uncertain fate that faced every man who climbed into a cockpit and launched toward hostile territory. On the chart at the Coordination Center, Mitchell's red circle faded as the grease pencil mark was worn by hands brushing past it to mark newer cases, more urgent priorities. The circle remained visible but diminished, a ghost of data representing a man whose location was unknown, whose condition was unknown, whose chances of survival decreased with every hour that passed without rescue. Vance knew the statistics. Pilots who survived more than 5 days adrift were rare exceptions, their rescues the result of extraordinary luck or exceptional resourcefulness, or both. Most men succumbed within 4 days, claimed by dehydration or exposure, or the simple psychological collapse that occurred when hope exhausted itself and the body followed. Mitchell was approaching that threshold, alone on an ocean that stretched beyond every horizon, equipped with resources that might keep him alive if he used them wisely and if circumstances favored him. But absent the rescue that required someone to look in the right place at the right time, with the right weather conditions, and the operational flexibility to execute recovery. The machinery of rescue had functioned as designed. A report filed, coordinates broadcast, a search conducted within the limits of available resources, but the machinery was imperfect. Constrained by the same limitations that defined all military operations in a theater, where demand exceeded supply and where priorities had to be continuously calculated according to the cold logic of maximum benefit from finite means. Mitchell's case remained open in the system, a data point that would be reviewed periodically, a name that would be mentioned at coordination meetings when discussing lessons learned or proposing improvements to search procedures. But the active effort to find him, to vector aircraft to his position, to commit resources specifically to his rescue, had ended. He was now in the category of cases where rescue would occur only through chance encounter. A patrol aircraft that happened to pass within visual range, a submarine that surfaced near his position, a ship whose route brought it close enough for lookouts to spot the yellow raft. Chance encounters happened occasionally, often enough to be documented in the records, but rarely enough to be notable when they occurred. Most pilots in Mitchell's category were never found, their fates recorded as presumed lost at sea, their names added to the long list of missing who were commemorated in memorial services and official records but whose bodies were never recovered, whose exact circumstances of death remained unknown, whose families received the standardized condolence letters that offered sympathy but no closure. The ocean kept its secrets, and the war moved forward, and the Coordination Center continued its work, marking new circles on the chart, allocating scarce resources against impossible need, accepting that some men would be saved and others would be lost, according to calculations that were rational but never entirely just. The signal in the dark. Mitchell's awareness of time had become distorted by the third day, the hours blending into a continuous state of discomfort, punctuated by small rituals that provided structure, sips of water at intervals he estimated by the sun's position, systematic scans of the horizon that he conducted with mechanical regularity, adjustments to his position in the raft to minimize contact with surfaces that had rubbed his skin raw. The sunburn had progressed beyond pain, into a kind of numbness, his face and neck tight with damaged tissue that would blister and peel if he survived long enough for the healing process to begin. His lips were cracked and bleeding despite his attempts to keep them moistened with small amounts of water, the salt air and constant sun exposure creating fissures that split deeper each time he moved his mouth. His hands trembled with a fine motor tremor that he recognized as a sign of advancing dehydration despite his rationing efforts. The body's systems beginning to falter as fluid deficit accumulated beyond what small water intake could offset. He was dying by degrees, the process slow enough that he remained functional but fast enough that he could measure the deterioration in observable symptoms. The psychological toll was harder to quantify, but more pervasive than the physical damage. Mitchell had always considered himself mentally disciplined, capable of enduring hardship through force of will and training, but the isolation was eroding that confidence in ways he hadn't anticipated. The silence was particularly oppressive, not true silence, because the ocean produced constant sound from wind and waves, but the absence of human voices, of mechanical noises, of anything that indicated civilization existed somewhere beyond his diminishing horizon. He found himself talking aloud occasionally, narrating his actions or simply speaking to hear a human voice, then stopping abruptly when he recognized the behavior as a marker of deteriorating mental state. He tried to maintain routines that imposed order on the formless passage of time. Morning inspection of the raft and equipment, midday water ration, afternoon scan routine, evening assessment of his condition, but the routines felt increasingly arbitrary, gestures toward normalcy in a situation that had no normal parameters. The third night brought a clarity that felt almost hallucinatory, though Mitchell recognized he was still rational, still capable of logical thought. The stars overhead were impossibly bright, the Milky Way a luminous band that stretched across the entire sky. and he spent hours identifying constellations he'd learned during navigation training: Orion, Cassiopeia, the Southern Cross that dominated the southern horizon and confirmed his approximate latitude. The stars were beautiful and indifferent, their light traveling across distances that made his predicament seem cosmically insignificant, and he found both comfort and despair in that perspective. Comfort because his suffering was temporary regardless of outcome, lasting only until rescue arrived or until his body's systems failed completely. Despair because the universe cared nothing for his survival, because his death would change nothing except in the small sphere of people who knew him, and because he was facing the possibility that his life would end not dramatically but through simple attrition. Alone and unmourned, except in the delayed grief his family would experience when the telegram arrived weeks after he'd actually died. He had thought about his parents frequently during the past 70 hours, imagining them receiving the notification, seeing his mother's face as she read the careful military language that would inform her of his missing status. He wondered if they had received the letter yet, wondered what they were doing at this precise moment. Sleeping, probably, given the time difference, his father snoring in the way that had driven his mother to a separate bedroom years ago. His mother perhaps lying awake because she'd always been a light sleeper, neither of them yet aware that their son was adrift in the Pacific with declining prospects for survival. The thought of their grief hurt worse than the sunburn, worse than the thirst, worse than the physical deterioration he could feel progressing through his body. He had written them regularly since shipping overseas, careful letters that mentioned nothing classified, but conveyed his general well-being, his adaptation to military life, his confidence in his training and equipment. Those letters had been lies of omission. He had never mentioned the friends who'd been killed, the missions that had gone badly, the constant low-grade fear that accompanied every flight into contested airspace. He had protected them from the reality of his war, and now that protection seemed like a cruelty, because they would have no preparation for the news that he was missing, no gradual adjustment to the possibility of his death. The fourth day dawned with weather that was clearer than the previous mornings, the convective buildup delayed by some atmospheric condition Mitchell didn't understand, but appreciated because it meant extended visibility. He conducted his morning routine with particular attention, knowing that good weather increased the probability of search aircraft, if any were still looking for him. He had no way to know whether searches had been conducted, whether anyone had flown over his position while he slept, or while rain obscured visibility, whether the military had already written him off as lost. The uncertainty was its own form of torture, the not knowing that prevented him from either maintaining hope or accepting finality. He checked the flare pistol for the dozenth time, verifying that the mechanism wasn't corroded by salt exposure, that the 4 cartridges remained dry in their waterproof storage, that he could load and fire quickly if the opportunity arrived. The flares had become totemic objects, physical representations of possibility, that he handled with reverence, knowing that wasting them would be unforgivable, but also knowing that failing to use them at the right moment would be equally fatal. By mid-morning, he had consumed the last of the water from the original containers, leaving only the canvas bag's contents and whatever rain might come. The depletion felt significant beyond the actual quantity involved. He had crossed a threshold, moved from managing existing resources to being entirely dependent on weather he couldn't control. If rain didn't come within the next 2 days, he would face the final stages of dehydration, the point where cognitive function deteriorated into confusion and then unconsciousness. He had, perhaps, 48 hours of marginal functionality remaining, maybe less, if heat stress accelerated fluid loss. The timeline focused his attention wonderfully, eliminating the psychological space for long-term planning or abstract hope. He would survive or die based on what happened in the next 2 days, and everything else was irrelevant. The afternoon brought the usual cloud buildup, but the cells remained scattered rather than coalescing into the solid front that had characterized previous days. Mitchell watched them drift across the sky, calculating whether any would pass directly overhead and deliver rain, seeing that most were tracking north of his position. One cell approached close enough that he prepared the canvas bag for collection, but the rain fell in a curtain that passed a quarter-mile to his west, close enough that he could smell it, could see the gray veil of precipitation, but too far to provide any benefit. He watched the rain move away with something approaching rage, an emotional response disproportionate to the event, but proportionate to his situation. And he had to force himself to breathe slowly, to release the anger, because it served no purpose except to elevate his heart rate and increase his body's metabolic demands. The rain moved on, and the afternoon continued, and Mitchell returned to his scanning routine, sweeping the horizon methodically, seeing nothing. The sun set with theatrical color, the western sky turning orange and red and purple in layers that would have seemed beautiful if Mitchell had possessed any capacity for aesthetic appreciation. Instead, he watched the light fade with clinical attention, noting the exact moment when the sun's disk dropped below the horizon, beginning his count of the final minutes of useful visibility before darkness rendered visual searching impossible. He had perhaps 30 minutes of twilight remaining, 30 minutes during which an aircraft could still spot his raft if one passed within range. After that, he would be invisible until dawn, unless he used a flare, which meant making the decision about night signaling, whether to fire on sound alone or to preserve his resources for daylight use when visibility was better, but when no aircraft had appeared for 3 consecutive days. The decision was interrupted by the sound he had been simultaneously hoping for and dreading, the distant drone of aircraft engines, faint but distinct, coming from the southeast. Mitchell's entire body tensed, every nerve suddenly alert, the fatigue and discomfort momentarily forgotten as he focused on the sound. It was definitely an aircraft, definitely growing louder but still too distant to be certain of type or direction. He grabbed the flare pistol from its storage pouch, his hands shaking with more than just dehydration tremor, as he loaded one of the cartridges into the chamber. The sound grew incrementally louder, the engine note suggesting a multi-engine aircraft, possibly a patrol plane, definitely not the high-pitched whine of fighters. Mitchell scanned the darkening sky, seeing nothing yet, the aircraft still below the horizon or obscured by clouds, but definitely approaching, definitely getting closer. The calculus he had rehearsed mentally dozens of times now had to be executed in real time with imperfect information. The aircraft was approaching, but he couldn't see it. The light was fading rapidly, perhaps 10 minutes until full darkness. If he waited for visual confirmation, the aircraft might pass while visibility was too poor to spot his raft. If he fired now based on sound alone, he might waste a flare on an aircraft that was farther away than it sounded, that was on a course that would take it miles from his position, that might not even be searching for survivors but simply transiting the area. He had 4 flares. This decision would determine whether he retained all 4 or reduced his remaining chances by 25%. The sound grew louder, definitely closer, and Mitchell made the decision based on probability and desperation. He would fire. The AN M8 flare pistol was simple to operate, a break-open single-shot design that required pulling back the hammer and squeezing the trigger. Mitchell aimed at a 45-degree angle into the southern sky, the direction where the engine sound was strongest, and fired. The flare launched with a hollow thump and a sharp recoil that surprised him despite knowing it was coming, the projectile arcing upward trailing a slight spiral of smoke, then igniting at the apex of its trajectory into brilliant magnesium incandescence that transformed night into temporary day. The flare burned with intensity that hurt his dark-adapted eyes, casting harsh shadows across the raft, illuminating the water's surface in a circle perhaps 100 yards in diameter, hanging in the sky for seconds that felt both eternal and too brief. Mitchell watched it burn, watched it begin its descent, watched it fall toward the water still burning, and in those seconds he saw nothing except his own raft suddenly visible in merciless detail, the water around him reflecting the flare's light, and the empty sky where he had hoped to see an aircraft responding to his signal. The flare hit the water and extinguished instantly, darkness returning with shocking completeness. His night vision destroyed by the magnesium's brightness, everything beyond the raft now invisible behind the purple afterimages that danced across his retinas. The engine sound continued, steady and unchanging, neither growing louder nor fading, suggesting the aircraft was maintaining course and altitude, possibly unaware of his flare, possibly having seen it, but unable to respond, possibly never having been close enough to spot the signal against the vast darkness of the ocean. Mitchell sat in the darkness, feeling the weight of his decision. One flare expended, 3 remaining. The aircraft sound beginning to fade now as the plane continued past his position, and he experienced a despair so complete it felt physical, a pressure in his chest that made breathing difficult. With such perfect timing it seemed choreographed, a second flare ignited in the sky to the south. A brilliant point of light that could only be a military flare fired in response to his signal, the acknowledgement he had hoped for. The confirmation that he had been seen. Mitchell's despair transformed instantly into something that wasn't quite hope, but was infinitely better than the emptiness he'd been feeling. They had seen him. An aircraft crew had spotted his flare, had recognized it as a distress signal rather than random phenomena, had responded with their own flare to confirm contact. The answering flare burned for its brief life and fell. And then there was darkness again. But the darkness was different now, because Mitchell was no longer alone, no longer invisible, no longer a man the world had forgotten. The engine sound changed, the aircraft turning, the Doppler shift audible as the plane came around, the pilot adjusting course to circle Mitchell's position. He loaded a second flare into the pistol, waiting for instructions he knew would come, watching the sky for the aircraft he still couldn't see, but knew was there. The engines grew louder again, the aircraft completing its turn, and Mitchell heard a new sound. A flare igniting overhead, then another, the aircraft dropping illumination flares that burst into sustained light suspended beneath small parachutes, transforming the ocean's surface into a surreal landscape of harsh illumination and deep shadows. In the light from the aircraft's flares, Mitchell could finally see his rescuers, a PBY Catalina flying boat, its distinctive twin-engine configuration and high wing unmistakable even in the artificial light, circling at perhaps 500 feet, low enough that he could see the hull configuration, the observation blisters, the markings that confirmed it was a U.S. Navy aircraft. The Catalina completed another orbit, then descended lower, and Mitchell heard a loudspeaker crackle to life, a voice distorted by amplification and distance but comprehensible. Survivor in raft, acknowledge with signal if you require assistance. Mitchell raised the flare pistol and fired his second cartridge, the flare arcing up and burning, a clear response that confirmed he was alive and needed rescue. The voice from the Catalina responded, "Acknowledged. Maintain your position. Rescue assets are being vectored to your coordinates. Estimated arrival 30 minutes. Acknowledge if you can wait." Mitchell fired his third flare, a single burst that signaled affirmative, that told them he was functional enough to wait, that rescue was possible if they could get assets to him quickly. The Catalina continued circling, dropping additional illumination flares every few minutes to maintain visibility, to keep Mitchell's raft marked so that incoming rescue units could find the position. Mitchell sat in the raft watching the aircraft above him, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, the physical manifestation of survival. And he allowed himself to believe for the first time in 4 days that he might actually live through this. The terror and the exhaustion and the deterioration of the past 96 hours had not been for nothing. He had conserved his flares correctly, had made the right decision about when to fire, had signaled at the moment when someone was positioned to see and respond. The mathematics of survival had aligned in his favor, and he was no longer alone on the empty ocean, but a man whose position was known, whose condition was being assessed, whose rescue was now a matter of logistics rather than probability. The 30 minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Mitchell watching the Catalina circle, counting illumination flares, rationing the final moments of his ordeal with the same discipline he'd used to ration water. He could feel his body beginning to shut down now that survival seemed assured, the adrenaline that had sustained him through the signaling sequence draining away, leaving exhaustion so profound he had to fight to stay alert. But he couldn't allow himself to collapse yet. couldn't permit unconsciousness until hands other than his own were responsible for his safety. He maintained his position, maintained his vigilance, maintained his grip on consciousness through sheer will, while above him the Catalina maintained its patient orbit. And somewhere beyond the circle of illuminated water, rescue was approaching through the darkness. And the equation that had seemed impossible to solve was resolving toward a conclusion that would end not in the ocean's indifferent depths, but in the crowded, noisy, blessed normality of military operations where men lived to fly another day. The mechanics of salvation. The rescue asset vectored to Mitchell's position was a destroyer escort, USS Samuel B. Roberts, designated DE-4. 1-3, a compact warship designed for anti-submarine warfare and convoy protection, but frequently tasked with the secondary mission of recovering downed airmen when operational circumstances permitted. The ship had been conducting a routine patrol 17 nautical miles from Mitchell's position when the Catalina's radio transmission reached the destroyer's communications center, requesting assistance with pilot recovery at coordinates that fell within the Samuel B. Roberts operational area. The ship's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes, made the decision to divert from patrol course and proceed at flank speed to the rescue coordinates, calculating that the detour would cost 90 minutes of patrol time, but represented exactly the kind of mission flexibility that made the difference between a successful rescue and another name added to the missing list. Hayes ordered course change and speed increase, the destroyer escort's turbines spinning up to deliver 24 knots through seas that were moderate, but building as evening winds increased surface chop. The ship's executive officer, Lieutenant James Peterson, supervised preparation of the rescue detail, a team of 4 sailors trained in man-overboard recovery procedures, equipped with life rings, rescue nets, and a motorized whaleboat that could be lowered if sea conditions prevented direct recovery from the destroyer's deck. Peterson briefed the team quickly and professionally, emphasizing that the pilot had been in the water for approximately 96 hours and would likely be in compromised physical condition, possibly hypothermic despite tropical waters, certainly dehydrated, potentially injured from ditching impact or exposure. The corpsman, pharmacist's mate second-class Vincent Martinez, prepared his aid bag with supplies for immediate treatment, intravenous fluids for rehydration, blankets for warming, splints for potential fractures, morphine for pain management if required. Martinez had conducted 3 previous pilot recoveries during his 14 months aboard Samuel B. Roberts, and he approached this one with the calm competence that came from experience, knowing that the condition of downed pilots varied dramatically depending on how long they'd been adrift and what injuries they'd sustained during bailout or ditching. The Catalina continued its orbit over Mitchell's position, maintaining illumination through a series of flares that turned the night ocean into a stage lit by harsh descending light. The aircraft's pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, managed his fuel state carefully, knowing that he had perhaps 45 minutes of station time remaining before he would need to depart for base or face a fuel emergency of his own. Webb's navigator had confirmed Mitchell's coordinates and relayed them to the Samuel B. Roberts with sufficient precision that the destroyer should have no difficulty locating the raft once it arrived within visual range. Webb's crew maintained radio contact with both the destroyer and the pilot in the raft, the latter communication one-way since Mitchell had no radio. But Webb's co-pilot periodically addressed the pilot through the loudspeaker system, providing updates on rescue progress, offering encouragement, maintaining the human connection that prevented the downed pilot from sliding back into the psychological isolation that characterized his previous 4 days. The Samuel B. Roberts covered the 17 nautical miles in 42 minutes, the destroyer's bow cutting through swells and throwing spray that caught the moonlight in brief silver arcs. The ship's lookout spotted the Catalina's illumination flares from 5 miles out, the distinctive parachute-suspended lights marking the rescue coordinates with precision that eliminated any navigation uncertainty. Hayes ordered speed reduction as the ship approached, not wanting to overshoot the position or create excessive wake that would complicate the recovery operation. At 1 mile distance, lookouts equipped with binoculars acquired visual contact with Mitchell's raft, the yellow fabric visible in the flare light as a small geometric shape against the dark water. Hayes maneuvered the destroyer to approach from downwind, using the ship's bulk to create a lee that would provide calmer water on the recovery side. Executing the approach with the precision that came from hundreds of hours of ship handling experience. The destroyer came alongside the raft at a distance of 30 feet, close enough for recovery operations, but far enough to prevent the ship's hull from crushing the inflatable against the water's surface. Searchlights from the destroyer illuminated the scene with white light that was harsh but steady, better than the flickering flare illumination for assessing the pilot's condition and coordinating the recovery. Mitchell sat in the raft looking up at the destroyer's hull, which seemed impossibly large from his water-level perspective, the steel plates rising like a cliff face, the faces of sailors visible along the rail looking down at him. He heard voices calling instructions, heard the mechanical sounds of equipment being deployed, heard the diesel growl of the whaleboat's engine as it was lowered from the destroyer's davits into the water. The whaleboat was crewed by 3 sailors, under the supervision of boatswain's mate, First Class Thomas O'Brien, a 20-year Navy veteran who had conducted countless small boat operations in conditions ranging from flat calm to near-storm seas. O'Brien piloted the whaleboat away from the destroyer and toward Mitchell's raft, closing the distance carefully, aware that the pilot might have reduced motor control and coordination after 4 days of exposure. The whaleboat came alongside the raft, and O'Brien's crew reached out to stabilize the inflatable, while Martinez, the corpsman, addressed Mitchell directly. "Can you move on your own, sir? Or do you need assistance?" Mitchell tried to answer, and discovered his voice was nearly gone, reduced to a croak that barely carried across the few feet separating the boats. He nodded instead, indicating he could move, and began the process of shifting his weight from the raft to the whaleboat. The transfer was more difficult than Mitchell had anticipated. His legs had been in the same general position for 4 days, and the muscles responded sluggishly to commands his brain issued, creating a disconnect between intention and execution that was disorienting. He got one leg over the whaleboat's gunwale, then the second, his hands gripping the rail with trembling strength. And then O'Brien's crew was lifting him, supporting his weight, lowering him carefully to the whaleboat's deck, where Martinez immediately began his assessment. The corpsman's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking pulse, breathing, pupil response, skin temperature, and turgor. Martinez wrapped a blanket around Mitchell's shoulders, noting the severe sunburn, the cracked lips, the obvious dehydration markers. He inserted an IV catheter into Mitchell's forearm with smooth competence, hooking up a bag of saline solution that would begin addressing the fluid deficit, then secured the IV bag to a bracket and signaled O'Brien that the patient was stable for transport. The whaleboat returned to the Samuel B. Roberts, coming alongside where a rescue net had been rigged, a cargo net hanging down the destroyer's hull that would allow Mitchell to be hauled aboard or, if he lacked the strength to climb, to be pulled up while lying in the net's folds. Martinez climbed the net first, carrying the IV bag, while sailors above secured lines around Mitchell's torso to assist his ascent. Mitchell managed to climb most of the way under his own power, his hands finding holds in the net's rope mesh, his feet finding purchase despite the trembling in his legs. The sailors above hauling on the support lines to take most of his weight. He came over the rail and onto the destroyer's deck, and hands caught him, lowered him to a sitting position, removed the blanket that had gotten tangled during the climb, and replaced it with a clean one. Martinez knelt beside him, checking the IV line, taking a blood pressure reading, asking questions in a calm voice. "Can you tell me your name, sir? Can you tell me what day it is?" Mitchell managed to croak his name and rank, but he had no idea what day it was, had lost track somewhere during the endless succession of sun and darkness and waiting. Martinez nodded as if this was expected and continued his assessment, shining a penlight into Mitchell's eyes, palpating his abdomen for signs of internal injury, checking his extremities for fractures or dislocations. Lieutenant Commander Hayes appeared, crouching down to address Mitchell directly. "Welcome aboard the Samuel B. Roberts, Lieutenant. We're going to get you below to sick bay, where the corpsman can take proper care of you. You did good work staying alive out there." Mitchell tried to thank him, but his voice failed completely, and Hayes waved off the attempt. "Save your strength. We'll talk later." Two sailors helped Mitchell to his feet and supported him as they walked him across the deck toward a hatch that led below, Martinez following with the IV bag held high. The ship's interior was warm and smelled of diesel fuel, cooking oil, and the particular metallic odor that characterized all naval vessels. They descended a ladder, Mitchell's feet finding the rungs uncertainly, and moved through a narrow passageway to the sick bay, a small compartment containing two bunks, a fold-down examination table, and storage lockers filled with medical supplies. Martinez directed Mitchell to one of the bunks, helped him lie down, and elevated his feet to improve circulation. The corpsman hung the IV bag from a hook mounted on the bulkhead and adjusted the drip rate, then brought a cup of water with a straw. "Small sips, sir. Don't try to drink it all at once, or you'll vomit and we'll have to start over." Mitchell sipped the water, feeling it coat his damaged mouth and throat, tasting the chlorination that indicated it had come from the ship's potable water system, thinking that he had never tasted anything better. He finished the cup slowly, Martinez watching to ensure he didn't drink too fast, then lay back against the pillow, feeling the bunk beneath him, solid and unmoving compared to the constant motion of the raft. The ship's vibration from the engines transmitted through the hull and into the bunk, a low-frequency hum that was mechanical and human-made, and therefore profoundly comforting. He was aboard a U.S. Navy warship staffed by competent professionals, no longer solely responsible for his own survival, no longer making decisions about water rationing and flare deployment. The responsibility had been transferred to others, and the relief was so intense it brought tears that surprised him, salt water leaking from his eyes to run down his sunburned cheeks. Martinez noticed but said nothing, simply wiping the tears away with a gauze pad and checking Mitchell's vital signs again, pulse still elevated, but stronger than initial assessment. Blood pressure low but improving with IV hydration. Respiration regular if somewhat rapid. The corpsman made notes on a medical form, documenting Mitchell's condition for the official record and for transfer to higher medical authority once the ship reached port. He applied antibiotic ointment to Mitchell's sunburned face and neck, covered the worst areas with sterile dressings, and gave Mitchell 2 salt tablets with another cup of water to help restore electrolyte balance. The treatment was basic but appropriate, addressing the immediate threats while recognizing that full recovery would require time and resources beyond what the destroyer's limited medical facilities could provide. Above deck, the recovery operation had concluded, and the Samuel B. Roberts was resuming normal operations. The whaleboat had been hoisted back aboard and secured. The rescue detail had been dismissed, and the ship had resumed its patrol course with Mitchell's rescue noted in the deck log with the same professional brevity that characterized all operational entries. 22:47 hours recovered 1 survivor from water, pilot from downed F6F aircraft, identity confirmed as Lieutenant James Mitchell, USNR, condition stable, proceeding on assigned patrol. Released from station-keeping duty now that the destroyer had successfully recovered the pilot, had departed for its base, Webb and his crew, satisfied with a mission that had produced the outcome all search and rescue operations sought, but not all achieved. The illumination flares had been secured, the searchlights extinguished, and the destroyer had returned to darkened ship conditions appropriate for night operations in waters where Japanese submarines and aircraft remained a threat. In the sick bay, Mitchell drifted in and out of sleep as his body began processing the rehydration and the release from constant stress. Martinez checked on him every 30 minutes throughout the night, monitoring vital signs, changing IV bags as they emptied, ensuring that the recovery was progressing without complications. Mitchell woke periodically, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, before remembering where he was and why. Each time he woke, Martinez was there, offering water or adjusting blankets, or simply providing the quiet professional presence that confirmed Mitchell was safe. By dawn, the second IV bag had been completed, and Mitchell's vital signs had stabilized sufficiently that Martinez felt comfortable removing the IV line and transitioning to oral hydration exclusively. Lieutenant Commander Hayes visited the sick bay after the morning watch change, finding Mitchell awake and significantly more alert than he'd been during recovery 12 hours earlier. Hayes sat on the spare bunk and conducted an informal debriefing, asking about Mitchell's squadron, his mission profile, the circumstances of his ditching, and his time in the raft. Mitchell's voice had recovered enough to speak, though it remained hoarse, and he provided the information methodically, using the clinical language that military culture preferred for operational reports. Hayes listened without interrupting, making notes on a small pad, gathering the details that would be included in the rescue report and forwarded to Mitchell's squadron and to the Search and Rescue Coordination Center. When Mitchell finished, Hayes asked the question that was part tactical inquiry and part human curiosity. "What made you fire that flare when you did? You couldn't see us yet." Mitchell considered the question, remembering the decision calculus, the sound of engines in the darkness, the recognition that waiting for visual confirmation might mean missing the opportunity entirely. The sound was getting louder, but I was losing light. I calculated that firing based on audio contact was better odds than waiting for visual confirmation that might not come before full dark. I got lucky that you were close enough to see it, and that you were a rescue asset rather than just a transit flight. Hayes nodded slowly. It wasn't just luck. You made the right call based on the information available. Plenty of pilots would have hesitated and missed their window. Your decision-making kept you alive out there. The destroyer made port 36 hours after recovering Mitchell, pulling into the harbor at a forward base, where medical facilities were more comprehensive than the ship's sick bay could provide. Mitchell was transferred to the base hospital for evaluation, the corpsman there conducting tests that confirmed severe dehydration, second-degree sunburn across approximately 30% of his body surface, minor contusions from the ditching impact, and general debilitation from 4 days of exposure. The prognosis was full recovery with rest and treatment, estimated timeline 2 weeks before return to flight status. Mitchell was assigned to a ward bed in a Quonset hut that served as the hospital's recovery wing, surrounded by other servicemen recovering from injuries ranging from combat wounds to disease to operational accidents. The ward was crowded and noisy and smelled of disinfectant and medications, and Mitchell found it comforting in its mundane functionality. The routine of meal times and medication rounds and doctor's visits providing structure that was restorative after the formless time adrift. The official notification of his recovery was transmitted through communication channels that reached his squadron within hours of his arrival at the base hospital. The message was brief and factual. LT. Mitchell recovered by USS Samuel B. Roberts. Condition stable, hospitalized for treatment, expected full recovery. Quote, at his squadron, the notification arrived during morning briefing, and Lieutenant Commander Harrington read it aloud to the assembled pilots, who received the news with visible relief and quiet satisfaction. Mitchell's belongings were retrieved from storage, his bunk status was changed from reassigned to occupied, and the letter to his parents was amended before being sent, the original draft language about missing in action replaced with new text that reported his successful rescue and current hospitalization for minor injuries. Expected to return to duty shortly. The amended letter would arrive in Oregon weeks after Mitchell had already returned to flying status, but it would carry news that transformed uncertainty into relief, that confirmed their son had survived when survival had seemed improbable. In the hospital ward, Mitchell slept for most of the first 3 days, his body shutting down non-essential functions to focus on healing, waking only for meals and medical checks before dropping back into sleep that was deeper and more restorative than anything he'd experienced in the raft. When he finally emerged from the exhaustion, he found himself thinking not about the ordeal, but about the chain of events that had made rescue possible. Harrington's accurate position report, the Catalina crew's dedication to search despite weather and operational constraints, Webb's decision to respond to his flare with an answering signal, Hayes's willingness to divert his ship for a rescue operation, O'Brien and Martinez's professional execution of the recovery. Dozens of people had made decisions that collectively produced his survival, and while he had played his part through discipline and decision-making, the ultimate outcome had depended on a system that functioned imperfectly, but had functioned well enough in his case to overcome the odds and deliver him back from the edge of the ocean's indifference. The reckoning and the return. The base hospital discharged Mitchell after 14 days of treatment. The doctors, satisfied that his physical condition had recovered sufficiently to resume light duty even if he wasn't yet cleared for flight operations. The sunburn had healed into peeling skin that itched constantly. The dehydration damage had been reversed through careful rehydration protocols, and the weight he'd lost during 4 days adrift was being slowly restored through a diet that emphasized calories and protein. He looked gaunt in the mirror, his flight suit hanging loose on a frame that had shed 12 pounds, his face marked by the tan lines where sunburn had been most severe. The physical markers would fade with time. But Mitchell recognized that something less visible had changed during those 96 hours alone on the Pacific. A recalibration of assumptions about control and vulnerability that he suspected would persist long after his body had fully recovered. The truck transport from the hospital back to his squadron's airfield took 3 hours over roads that varied from decent packed coral to rutted dirt that turned to mud during afternoon rains. Mitchell rode in the back with 5 other servicemen returning from various medical treatments, the canvas cover providing shade but trapping heat that made the journey uncomfortable, despite being far better than the conditions he'd endured in the raft. He watched the landscape pass through the truck's open rear, jungle vegetation dense and green, occasional clearings where construction battalions had carved out supply depots or ammunition dumps, native villages that appeared briefly then disappeared behind walls of foliage. The island was one of dozens that had been transformed from tropical isolation into military infrastructure supporting the advance across the Pacific. Each one a temporary foothold in a campaign that moved forward relentlessly, despite individual setbacks and losses. The squadron area looked exactly as Mitchell remembered it. The rows of tents and Quonset huts arranged with military precision, the flight line visible beyond the administrative buildings where Hellcats sat in revetments protected by sandbag walls. He reported to the squadron commander's office, standing at attention while Major Carson reviewed the medical paperwork that cleared Mitchell for return to duty with restrictions. No flight operations for another week, pending final medical evaluation. Light administrative duties in the interim. Carson listened to Mitchell's brief summary of the ditching and rescue, asked a few clarifying questions about the mechanical failure that had precipitated the emergency, then shifted to the informal tone that characterized his leadership style. "Good to have you back, Mitchell. We wrote you off after 3 days when the search came up empty. The fact that you're standing here means you did something right out there." Mitchell accepted the assessment without elaboration, uncomfortable with praise for what felt like simple survival rather than accomplishment. He asked about the squadron's status during his absence, learning that operations had continued without major incident, that 2 replacement pilots had arrived to fill vacancies created by his loss and another pilot's rotation stateside, that the operational tempo remained high, with daily missions supporting ground operations on nearby islands still under contest. Carson dismissed him with instructions to check in with the flight surgeon the following morning, and to spend the interim period catching up on administrative matters and reintegrating with squadron routine. Mitchell saluted and left the office, stepping into afternoon heat that felt oppressive after 2 weeks in the temperature-controlled environment of the hospital. His bunk was in the same tent he'd occupied before the ditching, but the space felt different in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. His belongings had been returned to their original positions, footlocker at the end of the bunk, spare uniforms hanging from hooks on the tent's support poles, personal items arranged on the small shelf that served as the only storage beyond the locker. Everything was exactly as he'd left it, 96 hours before the flight that ended with his engine failure. Yet the space felt like it belonged to a different person, someone who hadn't spent 4 days calculating water rations and waiting for rescue that might never arrive. Mitchell unpacked the small bag of items he'd accumulated at the hospital: clean socks, a spare toothbrush, the paperback novel someone had left for him that he'd been too exhausted to read, and tried to settle back into the routine of squadron life. The other pilots acknowledged his return with the restrained camaraderie that military culture dictated, handshakes and brief expressions of relief that he'd made it back, followed by the immediate resumption of normal conversation about missions, aircraft maintenance, and the informal social dynamics that characterized any group of men living and working in close proximity. Lieutenant Harrington sought Mitchell out during the evening meal in the mess tent, sitting across the table with a food tray that contained the same unappetizing but adequate fare everyone received. Harrington asked how Mitchell was feeling, received an honest answer that he was still regaining strength but feeling functional, then addressed the question that had clearly been weighing on him. "I've been going over the navigation from that flight, double-checking the position coordinates I reported. I think they were accurate within 5 miles, but I keep wondering if we could have been more precise, if that would have made a difference in how quickly they found you." Mitchell shook his head slightly. "Your coordinates were solid. The problem wasn't the position report, it was drift. I was probably 10 or 15 miles from the ditching point by the time the Catalina found me. Even perfect coordinates wouldn't have helped unless the search pattern accounted for that displacement." Harrington absorbed this information, seeming somewhat relieved to have confirmation that his navigation hadn't been the limiting factor. He described the search status as he'd understood it: the single Catalina mission, the negative contact, the transition to suspended search when resources became unavailable. Mitchell listened without comment, understanding now how close he had come to being written off permanently, how the Catalina that eventually spotted him had been on a different mission entirely when his flare caught their attention. The rescue had been the result of coincidence as much as systematic search, a pilot on convoy escort happening to pass within range at the moment when Mitchell made the decision to fire based on engine sound alone. The conversation drifted to other topics: upcoming missions, rumors about strategic planning, speculation about when the war might end, given the progress being made across multiple fronts. Mitchell participated but felt slightly detached, as if he was watching the conversation from a small distance rather than fully engaging with it. The sensation wasn't unpleasant, just different, a subtle shift in perspective that made familiar interactions feel slightly foreign. He finished his meal and returned to his tent, lying on his bunk and staring at the canvas overhead, while around him other pilots prepared for evening activities: card games, letter writing, maintenance of personal equipment. The routine continued exactly as it had before his ditching, and Mitchell recognized that his absence and return had created barely a ripple in the squadron's operational continuity. The war was too large, the individual too small, for any single pilot's temporary loss to significantly impact the broader machinery of military operations. The flight surgeon cleared Mitchell for return to flight status after 9 days of light duty. Conducting a thorough physical examination and a shorter psychological assessment that focused on whether the ditching experience had created trauma that would affect his ability to function in the cockpit. Mitchell answered the questions honestly. Yes, he thought about the ditching frequently. No, he didn't experience intrusive memories that disrupted his daily functioning. Yes, he felt comfortable with the prospect of flying again. No, he didn't have recurring nightmares or anxiety symptoms that would indicate acute stress response. The surgeon noted that some level of heightened awareness after a near-death experience was normal and potentially adaptive. Signed the paperwork that cleared Mitchell for unrestricted duty and scheduled a follow-up evaluation in 30 days to ensure no delayed psychological symptoms emerged. Mitchell's first flight, after returning to duty, was a local orientation flight, a solo mission designed to reacquaint him with the Hellcat's handling characteristics and to verify that his skills remained sharp after 3 weeks without cockpit time. He conducted the pre-flight inspection with particular attention to the engine, checking oil levels and examining the cowling for any indication of the kind of deterioration that had led to his previous mechanical failure. The ground crew chief, the same staff sergeant from Pennsylvania who had signed off on his ditching flight, watched the inspection without comment. Understanding that Mitchell needed to personally verify the aircraft's condition before trusting it with his life again. The inspection revealed nothing concerning. The Hellcat was well maintained, all systems nominal, and Mitchell signed the aircraft acceptance form and climbed into the cockpit. The engine start procedure was exactly as he remembered it, the big radial coughing once, then catching into a smooth rumble that vibrated the entire airframe. Mitchell worked through the checklist methodically, checking instruments, testing controls, verifying radio function. The tower cleared him for takeoff and he taxied to the runway, the Hellcat's tailwheel configuration giving him the familiar restricted forward visibility that required S-turns during ground operations. At the runway threshold, he completed the final checks, received takeoff clearance, and advanced the throttle smoothly. The Hellcat accelerating down the pierced steel planking with the characteristic tail-up attitude that exposed the horizon ahead. The aircraft lifted off cleanly, and Mitchell raised the landing gear, established a climb attitude, and turned toward the practice area offshore, where he would spend the next hour reacquainting himself with the aircraft's performance envelope. The flight proceeded without incident, basic maneuvers executed smoothly, systems functioning normally, Mitchell's skills proving to be intact despite the layoff. But he found himself paying attention to engine sounds with heightened sensitivity, listening for any variation in pitch or rhythm that might indicate developing problems, checking oil pressure and temperature gauges more frequently than necessary. He recognized the behavior as hypervigilance, stemming from his ditching experience. Understanding intellectually that this level of monitoring was neither necessary nor healthy for long-term operations, but unable to fully suppress the instinct to watch for warning signs that might provide advance notice of impending failure. He completed the practice flight, returned to the airfield, and landed without difficulty, taxiing back to the revetment where the ground crew waited to secure the aircraft. The squadron commander reinstated Mitchell to the flight rotation immediately, assigning him to routine patrol missions that gradually rebuilt his confidence and normalized the experience of daily flight operations. Mitchell flew 6 missions in the following 2 weeks: combat air patrols, photo escort, armed reconnaissance, each one completed successfully. Each one slightly reducing the hypervigilance that had characterized his first flights back. The work was familiar and demanding, in ways that left little psychological space for dwelling on past trauma. And Mitchell found that operational routine was itself therapeutic, the repeated execution of procedures and missions creating a rhythm that pushed the ditching experience into memory rather than immediate concern. 3 weeks after returning to flight status, Mitchell participated in a strike mission against Japanese installations on a nearby island, flying as wingman in a 4-plane division tasked with providing fighter escort for a squadron of dauntless dive bombers. The mission proceeded through briefing, launch, transit, and target approach exactly as dozens of missions had proceeded before his ditching, but Mitchell noticed a subtle difference in his own mental state, a heightened appreciation for the infrastructure of support that made each mission possible. The briefing officers who provided intelligence, the mechanics who maintained aircraft, the radio operators who coordinated communications, the rescue coordination center that stood ready to vector assets if someone went down. He had always known these functions existed, but had taken them for granted as background elements of military operations. Now he saw them as the interconnected system that they were, recognizing that his own survival had depended on this system functioning adequately despite its imperfections and limitations. The strike mission encountered moderate anti-aircraft fire over the target, the sky marked by black puffs of exploding shells that the Hellcats maneuvered around while maintaining formation with the bombers. Mitchell flew his position with disciplined precision, maintaining situational awareness while scanning for enemy fighters that intelligence had suggested might be based at a nearby airfield. The bombers completed their runs and turned for home, the fighter escort staying with them through the vulnerable egress phase when Japanese fighters would most likely attempt interception. No enemy aircraft appeared, and the formation returned to base, having accomplished its mission without loss. The kind of successful operation that would be recorded with a brief entry in the squadron log and forgotten within days as subsequent missions demanded attention. In the ready room after the flight, during the informal debrief where pilots discussed the mission's execution and noted lessons learned, someone mentioned that Mitchell had completed his 10th mission since returning from medical leave, meeting the informal milestone that marked full reintegration into operational status. The observation was made casually, without ceremony, but Mitchell recognized its significance. He was no longer the pilot who had ditched and been rescued, but simply another squadron member executing the routine work of combat operations. The ditching had become part of his history rather than his defining characteristic, and this transition felt appropriate even as Mitchell knew he would never entirely forget those 4 days adrift or the calculations he'd made about flare usage and water rationing and the probability of rescue. The letter from his parents arrived 6 weeks after his rescue, forwarded through the military postal system that functioned with remarkable efficiency despite the vast distances and logistical complexities involved. His mother's handwriting covered 3 pages of thin airmail stationery, the words expressing relief that he had survived, concern for his health, and gratitude to the Navy personnel who had rescued him. She mentioned that the amended telegram had arrived just days after the original notification of his missing status, creating an emotional whiplash between fear and relief that had been difficult but ultimately bearable because the final news was positive. His father had added a brief postscript in his characteristic terse style, "Glad you made it back. Keep making smart decisions. See you when this is over." Mitchell read the letter multiple times, hearing his mother's voice in the phrasing, seeing his father's restrained emotion in the few words he'd contributed, feeling connected across thousands of miles to people who loved him and whose lives would have been permanently altered if his rescue hadn't occurred. He drafted a response that evening, sitting at the small field desk in the squadron administrative tent, trying to find language that would reassure without minimizing what had happened. He described the ditching in clinical terms, emphasized that his training had prepared him adequately for the survival situation, mentioned the professional competence of the rescue crews, and concluded with reassurance that he was fully recovered and back to normal duties. He didn't mention the fear he'd experienced during the 3rd night when the search had apparently been abandoned. Didn't describe the calculation he'd made about when to fire the flare, didn't reveal how close he'd come to becoming another name on the missing list. His parents didn't need those details, and Mitchell recognized that some experiences remained internal, processed privately rather than shared, even with people who cared deeply about his well-being. The war continued its progression across the Pacific, each week bringing new advances, new islands secured, new positions established closer to the Japanese home islands. Mitchell's squadron participated in this advance through the daily execution of missions that supported ground operations, interdicted enemy supply lines, and maintained air superiority over contested areas. The work was dangerous and demanding, and the squadron continued to lose pilots to combat, accidents, and operational mishaps at a rate that required constant influx of replacements to maintain operational strength. Mitchell became one of the experienced pilots that newer arrivals looked to for guidance, and he found himself passing along lessons learned through his own accumulation of flight hours and combat experience, including the survival procedures that had kept him alive during his time adrift. During a squadron briefing 3 months after his rescue, when a new pilot asked about ditching procedures and what to prioritize if forced to bail out over water, Mitchell provided practical advice based on direct experience. Conserve your flares until you have visual or audio confirmation of rescue assets. Don't waste them on hope. Ration water from the start, even if you think rescue will come quickly. The ocean's bigger than you think, and currents move you farther than you expect. Most importantly, make decisions based on probability rather than optimism. Your survival depends on correct assessment of your situation, not on hoping circumstances are better than they appear. The guidance was delivered without drama, practical information shared among professionals who all faced the possibility of finding themselves in similar circumstances. 8 months after his ditching, Mitchell completed his combat tour, accumulating sufficient flight hours and mission credits to qualify for rotation back to the United States. The return was processed through the same bureaucratic machinery that handled all personnel movements: orders cut, travel arranged, paperwork completed and filed. Mitchell packed his belongings, said abbreviated goodbyes to squadron mates who were continuing their tours, and climbed aboard a transport aircraft that would take him first to Hawaii, then to California, then eventually to separation processing and return to civilian life. As the transport climbed away from the island that had been his home for 14 months, Mitchell looked down at the ocean stretching in all directions. Recognizing that somewhere in that vast expanse of water was the approximate location where he'd spent 4 days waiting for rescue, where he'd made the decision to fire a flare based on engine sound alone, where the equation of his survival had hung in precarious balance. The ocean looked peaceful from altitude, its surface marked by cloud shadows and the occasional whitecap, giving no indication of the thousands of men who had died in those waters, or the infrastructure of war that spanned its entire breadth. Mitchell watched until the island disappeared behind clouds, then settled back in his seat for the long flight home, carrying with him the knowledge that survival was never guaranteed, that rescue depended on systems that functioned imperfectly, that individual decisions mattered, but so did timing and luck, and the competence of people whose names he would never know. He had been given a second chance through the convergence of accurate position reporting, persistent search efforts, his own disciplined resource management, and the simple coincidence of a Catalina pilot passing within range at the moment when he'd chosen to fire. The experience had changed him in ways both obvious and subtle, recalibrating his understanding of vulnerability and control, but it hadn't broken him, and he was returning home with his life intact and his future uncertain but possible, which was more than could be said for thousands of other pilots who had faced similar circumstances and found different outcomes. The war would end eventually, the campaigns would be studied and commemorated. The veterans would carry their experiences into civilian life, where the intensity and clarity of combat would fade into memory and be replaced by the mundane complexities of ordinary existence. But Mitchell knew he would never forget the sound of the Catalina's engines cutting through the darkness, the arc of his flare climbing into the night sky, the answering signal that confirmed he had been seen, and the profound relief of hands pulling him from the water and onto the destroyer's deck, where survival transitioned from individual responsibility to collective capability. Those moments would remain vivid regardless of how much time passed, permanent markers of the boundary between life and death, between isolation and connection, between the individual alone and the system that, despite all its limitations and failures, had functioned adequately when it mattered most to keep one more pilot alive in a war that consumed men by the thousands and would be remembered long after individual stories had been forgotten by everyone except those who lived them.